Welcome back. Let's continue with week 4 in this second video lecture. This part focuses on one of the key areas of concern in the context of digital technologies, that is, the challenges of regulation. With all the changes to media that is digitized to a cross-border existence as the norm, who is responsible for the different laws, policies, and so on that should govern communication flows? Should there be restrictions, and if so, what should these be and who will decide? Traditional media was nationally based with national laws. As a result, there are different political, social, and cultural norms around the media, and these reflect national cultural mores. Some media laws are even said to be part of sovereign security. For example, in consideration of who is allowed to own media, how much influence international corporations can have, and what responsibilities they have, such as paying taxes in a country where they operate, or even, as has been widely debated lately, whether international digital platforms should pay national news organisations for content, how much they should pay, and under what circumstances. In the era of transnational media, a concern in terms of legal jurisdiction is whose laws apply. It's a very complex situation. There are issues such as who would enforce these laws beyond your boundaries, and how would you pursue your laws in another country? We also see instances where different legal and regulatory regimes collide because different countries have individual approaches to media. New technology raises a number of concerns in relation to privacy, particularly in relation to data. On a small scale, we can see this in media and communications research and any other type of university-based research in ethics considerations. In applying for ethics clearance for a project, researchers always need to state where and how the data they collect will be stored, whether it will be anonymised, how long it will be stored for, and how and when it will be safely deleted. In the days when everything existed as paper files only and was stored in data filing cabinets, this was simpler, though there were still issues such as who had photocopies and how those files would be kept and later disposed of. Occasionally, there are still news stories about official files kept in filing cabinets that are disposed of inappropriately, such as at a rubbish dump, leaving sensitive information to be found by, well, anyone. But data storage in the digital age has become a much more complex issue, when even the act of deleting data does not necessarily delete it from a hard drive, let alone the cloud and the data files of anyone associated with the research. Many businesses contract other companies who specialize in data storage to do this work for them. This may result in offshore data storage as a cheaper solution. However, this further complicates the issues. For example, if this information is stolen, lost, or misused, it's increasingly difficult to follow that up if the data is stored offshore. The developers of these technologies might not consider the societal implications of their products. So a current challenge here is, what laws and regulations can countries put in place around data? And how can they enforce these laws and regulations? And how do you even ensure the data storage really is being carried out properly with respect to privacy of sensitive data? There's an increasing trade-off between convenience and privacy. For the convenience of accessing our data whenever and wherever we want to, we are increasingly sacrificing our ability to monitor who has access to it. Once that data crosses borders, the individual loses any degree of control over it. It's harder to detect misuse overseas and harder to hold them accountable. Anyone who's ordered a product over the internet from an overseas-based website, then either not received it or received an inferior product, will know there is very little you can do to prosecute the vendor, especially if they're not affiliated with a bigger corporation such as Amazon. Sometimes privacy and control are knowingly and willingly sacrificed. Other times, individuals are unaware of or only partly aware of what is happening, or haven't thought enough about the implications of what is happening. It's therefore increasingly important to understand how this challenge is going to be tackled in the global environment. Pelfrey sums up this challenge. As consumers and citizens, we repeatedly trade convenience for control, handing over growing amounts of information about ourselves to others in the process. Our lives are increasingly mediated by digital technologies and described by data held in digital formats. We are racing ahead quickly with the development of new technologies, while the institutions, legal and otherwise, designed to protect user privacy have lagged behind. The trade-offs involved are rarely conscious ones. Pelfrey makes the point about how much we are handing over our data to unreliable spheres simply so we can continue to have convenient access to things. An example of the importance of data protection is the Cambridge Analytica scandal, when data breaches involving Facebook were revealed by a whistleblower in 2018. Facebook was found to have sold a huge amount of data from millions of individuals to a political influencing organisation in the UK called Cambridge Analytica. This organisation had been contracted to use the data to spread fake information during political campaigns, most sensationally during the 2016 Trump election in the US, where it was claimed that Trump paid Cambridge Analytica for data. Facebook founder Zuckerberg had to testify in the US Congress, and Facebook was fined $5 billion by the Federal Trade Commission and £500,000 by the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK. So that's an example that is something beyond the individual concern, that data can even be used to fuel unethical political behaviour on a massive scale. And Facebook had to agree it was culpable in allowing this to happen, even with Zuckerberg still insisting Facebook was not a media company. There was a global public backlash against Facebook over this incident. Ultimately, though, as this demonstrates, when these large digital corporations act in a way that is out of step with public thinking, the only way they can be held accountable is within national jurisdictions and laws. Times are changing, though, as regions across the world attempt to regulate privacy laws internationally, as well as within a particular country or jurisdiction. The best known example is the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which was passed by the European Parliament in 2016 and enforced from May 2018. It replaced the old Data Protection Directive, which had been in effect since 1995, before the internet even became important as a business hub. The new data laws protect information such as addresses, digital data, health, racial or ethnic data, political opinions, and sexual orientation. Importantly, the GDPR is relevant to companies in many other countries and regions outside the EU, because in this world of trans-border trade and communications, companies are likely to have dealings with people based in the EU. The law applies to any business anywhere in the world that processes personal data relating to an individual in the European Union. This includes, say, contractors in companies which might be in the US or Australia. Contractors might be living in the EU and therefore they would be covered by that law. Also, the GDPR has influenced other areas of the world. For example, the California Consumer Privacy Act, or CCPA, was rolled out in January 2020 and is closely modelled on the GDPR. From a regulation perspective, it's a reminder that despite the global world we live in, our national governments still have an important role in setting up regulations that we value as societies. Each of these areas also has challenges and how they can be managed as trans-border and global media are increasingly opened up. So we have piracy and copyright concerns, security and breaches to that security, censorship and government control, and ways different countries approach control of their media, crime and trafficking, as well as cybercrime itself. This also covers the way the internet, and particularly the dark web, is used to facilitate crimes such as drugs and people trafficking, distributing child pornography, and all manner of other crimes. Gaps open up in how these challenges will be managed as trans-border and global media allows them to travel beyond national boundaries. Many of these categories are interconnected. For example, government censorship of websites that spread criminal material, live streaming of violent acts, and so on. On the other hand, if you have arguments regarding free speech and the concept of the slippery slope, you might be concerned. If you censor one type of information, will that lead to being able to censor other types of information, and eventually anything a government believes is sensitive? Who decides what people should be able to access? And what about if websites are international? Most governments around the world do restrict what their citizens can see, at least at some level. Global governance is an idea that rises again and again because it's so difficult for national governments to regulate media, and because national regulations are not effective beyond national boundaries, or not very effective. Would it be possible for global governance institutions to create policies and regulations to manage the media? There's an increasing push for global institutions to be set up to create global regulations and oversee media activity. They would create consistent rules and frameworks around the operation of media in a global environment, and also ways to enforce them. There are already quite a few global institutions that regulate and control communication systems, and they have done for such a long time. One example is the Universal Postal Union, or UPU, which started as far back as 1874 and which became a specialised agency of the UN in 1948. Today, the UPU has 192 member countries. Its members don't always agree. In fact, in 2018, the US threatened to leave the UPU by 2019, and a global congress was called to sort out the problems. There are still many ongoing debates around regulating media at a global level, and organisations such as the United Nations, which has its own Department of Global Communications to spread its messages, are largely seen as toothless tigers, meaning they don't really have any strong way of enforcing what member nations agree to. One UN group to look at is the Dynamic Coalition on the Sustainability of Journalism and News Media, which is a working group at the UN's Internet Governance Forum. The Dynamic Coalition last met in November 2020 to discuss internet governance procedures. However, we have again and again seen discussions and negotiations that have broken down, and it's almost impossible to bring countries around the world to any kind of simple consensus on how media and communications should be regulated. Wouldn't it be much easier, efficient, and simpler if we could all agree If all or most countries could meet together on policies regarding global governance of media and communications. In this global era, other goods and services are traded and exchanged relatively freely. So why doesn't this happen with media and communications? Why can't we just draw up a list of regulations the way the World Trade Organization has for trading of products? Basically, the WTO draws up agreements signed by their members, the majority of the world's trading countries. It is important to note that these still have to be ratified in each country's national parliament. With media and communications, the main problem is that different countries have to cooperate and agree on common global rules. But different countries hold diverse perspectives on what the role of media should be, how communications should operate, and how best to manage these things. There are different hierarchies of power in global politics, in which some nations can exert more influence on agendas than others. Communications and media themselves are much more than just commodities, not just goods to be traded, such as sports shoes or t-shirts. Media and communications are tied fundamentally to a range of functions within our nations and our societies. In some countries, values of democracy and the public sphere may be most important. In other countries, there are priorities of nation building and enshrining national identity. There is a range of different priorities that media and communications are seen to be accountable for. As a result, we cannot simply base regulation on an economic model alone that is simply about allowing free flow for business. So we can see then how difficult this global communications landscape is for us to negotiate. On one hand, there is a whole world of opportunities for us in terms of how we interact with communications and media. But as a result, there are many unresolved issues in terms of how we will manage this in future. In this, we are reminded again of the sheer power of media and communications across the world. That completes the 4 weeks of conceptual approaches of this unit. In the remaining 2 weeks, we will look at how you'll research and write your essay, incorporating the ideas, concepts, readings, and further individual investigations into your topic. Thanks for viewing.